Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the Replay series. I'm your host, Tracy Chernoff, and I'm thrilled to have you join us once again as we journey through the episodes that have topped charts around the world. In this podcast series, we're revisiting some of our most insightful, thought-provoking, and transformative conversations with industry experts, thought leaders, and practitioners. These episodes have made waves, sparking meaningful conversation and inspiring positive change throughout human resources. Whether you're a dedicated listener who's been with us from the start or you're just tuning in for the first time, the Replay series offers a chance to dive deep into the core principles that guide our exploration into HR practices. So get ready to rediscover the discussions that continue to shape the future of HR. Without further ado, let's step back in time and immerse ourselves into the podcast's top charted episodes. Let the replay begin. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. I'm really excited about this topic because we've touched on it a couple times. It's been sprinkled throughout the podcast these last 2 years, but we are going to be speaking about growth mindsets and really focusing in and honing in on that topic. And I'm not doing it alone. I'm doing it with an amazing guest, Dr. Brad Harris. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Brad Harris. He is a professor of management and human resources at HEC Paris and co-founder of the People Leader Accelerator. He's co-authored 2 books, 3D Team Leadership, A New Approach for Complex Teams, and Scaling for Success, People Priorities for High Growth Organizations. His research has been published in leading academic journals and cited in popular outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, CNBC, Inc.com, and Fast Company. Brad holds a Ph.D. from Texas A&M University and previously taught at the University of Illinois and Texas Christian University. Brad has won multiple teaching awards for his work in leadership development, including an international recognition from Poets and Quants. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Brad Harris. How are you? Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Tracy.
Of course. And before we even get into it, tell everyone, because I know I love this factoid, tell everyone where you are dialing in from.
Okay, we're dialing in. So I want to do the thing. Long time listener, first time caller, this deal. I'm calling in from Paris, France. So if for those that can see the video, it's got the Haussmann style building behind me. But for those that are listening, you can probably hear occasionally the traffic noise. So.
Right. And you know what? This is the beauty of life. I went from New York where there was constant traffic in the background, and now we've ventured out to Paris. And honestly, if I hear traffic from Paris, I'm going to feel like I'm there. So maybe we'll get a little bit of a dose of it if I'm lucky.
If you're lucky, right.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. Growth mindsets, adding value to growing organizations, to organizations in general. And of course, this topic of imposter syndrome is near and dear to my heart. Like I said in the intro, this has been sprinkled and kind of tossed around a little bit in the podcast, but I am no expert, unlike you. You are an expert and you teach this stuff. So why don't we just kick it off? Like, what is a growth mindset? Who can have a growth mindset? And where do we start?
Yeah, that is such an interesting place for us to start this interview. And I've got to warn you, I'm probably going to surprise you with this response. So I'm going to give a lengthy preamble here. I am all about growth. So with People Leader Accelerator, we're all about helping top of function HR leaders survive the hyper growth and high rapid growth of their organizations. But as part of that, we're also trying to help them scale up themselves and their own leadership capabilities. So I am 100% behind the growth story. That's how I anchor my teaching, my writing, and even these podcast appearances. And I think the general theme and how I approach this is we frequently, not always, but we frequently in our leadership journeys hit these moments where what got us here won't get us there. And that's like a really good adage that forces us to rethink what's important, what's not, what we need to add, what we need to drop, and things like that. Now, in terms of growth mindset, I'm an academic, and that comes with a lot of flaws. And one of them is I do not give straightforward answers. But let me give you the best part. Growth mindset is based on the research of Carol Dweck, who's an extremely talented and really influential scholar. And her original writing on this said people tend to have, people argue if it's state-based or these really deep-rooted dispositions. It's probably a little bit of both. We have these ideas that we are fixed and we can't get really substantively better on our own. We're just born the way we are. Or we have these incremental or growth mindsets, meaning we can add to who we are. And that makes a ton of sense. And her early work supported that. It suggested, like, if we can prime people to take on these growth mindsets versus these fixed mindsets, we can get some results. Since then, we have had a devil of a time in the practical sense, really altering people's mindsets at a systematic level. And so one really good review of this, critique of this literature, at least in how it's implemented in organizations, comes from Mark Efron with the Talent Strategy Group. You can find it on LinkedIn, but he distills some recent academic literature, including some meta-analyses that suggests, like, while growth mindset may be like a really good attitude for us to have, an outlook, even a mindset, as it may not be where we need to invest our training dollars. So I'm sort of in Mark's space here of, I love the spirit of it. I love what we're trying to do. I'm still trying to figure out what we actually do with Carol Dweck's work and how we take her general ideas and make it scale in organizations. So I've probably got a more nuanced take on the actual growth mindset term than a lot of people.
Right. Well, I think what's interesting about this is that I think that people throw this term around a lot. Growth mindset. Have a growth mindset. Think globally. But there is an importance in understanding what we say. And I remember early on in my career when I first kind of became aware of this ideal, and it was never explained to me. It was just like, think globally. But that's not the only thing that contributes to a growth mindset. You have to be open. You have to be self-aware. You have to be willing to change, willing to learn. And I say willing very intentionally because I'm a believer that people can change, but I'm not a believer that everyone wants to change. So when it comes to, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, can people change whether it's an academic environment, business environment, or even just personally? Can they change, or is there so much more to that?
There's a little bit more, but I sure hope they can change. And like you, as someone that's like dedicated her career to HR, and then you have this podcast, and I'm a teacher. Goodness, our whole lives fall apart, our professional lives at least, if we can't change.
Yes.
So I do think people are quite malleable, and that would be consistent with what Efron's saying and what Dweck's saying in her original work. So no problem there. The only parts that we're sort of stable on, and even then it's not completely stable, it's more of a general, it's a little harder to change, is our deep-rooted personality stuff. So like big 5 personality traits. But even that has a tendency to change over time with dramatic experiences or age. On all of these other things, skills, outlooks, ability to lead, I believe we can change. And you said it, so I can't take credit for it, but a big part of that, and I think this is where all of us, whether you're a critic of the growth mindset concept and academically or not, would agree, like a big part of this is, are you willing to actually do the hard work to change? So I'm with you on this one.
Yeah. No, I'm glad that we're aligned, and not that is not a prerequisite to being on the podcast. We do not have to agree on anything, but it is nice. It is nice that we agree on this. You know, when I think about the human condition, because this is the reality of HR for me, is that we are dealing with people. We have to focus on humanity. And with that comes this challenge of the nuance of the human condition. You never really know, people are so different, not only through their backgrounds and their experiences, but just in the way that they present themselves, like just who they are, including ourselves. And so when I think about what you're doing as a professor and also with the People Leader Accelerator, how does the growth mindset and its teaching flex itself to people from different backgrounds and upbringings and everything in between, whatever diversity means in this situation? How does it meet people where they are?
Wow, what a question. So one of the things, just to validate where you're coming from here, one of probably the top 2 or 3 principles that we're preaching in People Leader Accelerator, which is really targeted towards people that are leading the HR or people function at high growth companies, is this idea that the answer when we deal with people is almost always, it depends. Unfortunately, that's sort of an insufficient answer. Like, we have to do something.
It's true.
But the spirit of that is, and that brings up all kinds of tensions too. Like as leaders, we need to communicate like we're on Twitter and assume our audience has no attention span. Right. But we need to think and be able to interpret information and treat people like we're some great scholar. We have to really look for the nuance there. So what does that mean? Boy, it's a grand challenge, but I think what we're talking about, things like, do people want to change, or do they not want to change? And what is the cause of their resistance if they're in that camp? It's like, these people are complicated, and they're coming with stories, they're coming with fears, and they're coming with all sorts of things in their backpack that might make them fearful of trying something new, and in doing so, leaving something that they know they're good at, something that's comfortable. Ooh. And we all have different things in our backpack. So this is a mess, but it's a grand challenge that, like, this is where we make an impact.
Totally. I was just thinking about something that you said before, and also what you had said when we first connected a few months back, which is what got you here won't get you there. And that's stuck with me since our first conversation because, in my own personal career journey, I always have sights on the next thing. That's like how I am. And I know a ton of my listeners are in that wheelhouse, or that's in their wheelhouse as well. There's always like this, okay, what's next? Someone recently told me, well, as much as we can focus on what's next, sometimes we miss the whole journey in getting there. And so when you first said this to me, I don't know, I think at first I was like, oh, that's a really interesting, thought-provoking phrase. But now, after hearing that feedback and that advice from another party and reflecting on this, it makes me think, well, gosh, if I always take that approach, like the what's next approach, am I really going to get there? Because this is saying, like, what got you here isn't necessarily going to get you there. So how can I change the way that I approach the next step in my own career journey? So I'm proud of myself for that thought moment. But when you say that, what got you here won't get you there, how do people apply that day to day?
Yeah, so I can't take credit for that. That Marshall Goldsmith wrote a book about that name that talks about some of the traps we fall in when we move from some level of management into senior level management. And maybe his point was even more general, when we move from individual contributors into some sort of leadership role where we're in charge of others. Mm-hmm. I think this is where People Leader is focused, where People Leader Accelerator is focused. We're getting people that have like rapidly accelerated in job title and job responsibility, but maybe have never been strategic partners in their organization. So for them, this what got us here won't get us there mindset, I feel pretty safe in that saying. Like we're trying to push them to not do everything, not say yes to everything, be ruthless prioritizers of what's important, and more importantly, to protect their time so that they can be strategic, which means pushing down, delegating, all of these sorts of things. Now, to your point, I had a basketball coach in 8th or 9th grade, I think it was 9th grade, named Brian Townley. And I don't know if this was his quote or not, probably not, but it was, although he was a good coach. His point was, success is a journey, not a destination. You've probably heard something similar too. Yeah. And I think it gets at this idea that, yeah, it's easy to really start looking for the next steps. I'm kind of oriented the same way you are in this, like, what's next, what's next? And it's sort of a throwaway comment if we let it be that what got us here won't get us there. But we also have to remember the things that got us here are sort of important to our edge. And, not only is the journey important, but we're doing good things. And if we let go of all of the things that got us here, well, all of a sudden we probably have lost some of our value proposition.
Right. Wow. That is a really strong, really provocative in a way quote, that success is a journey, not a destination, because it immediately makes me think about the changes in the labor market and the work environment and everything that we've seen since COVID. And I was just speaking with someone about how women, especially in the workforce, have changed the way that they set boundaries because of wanting to be more connected to the family unit, and men also are in this bucket. And I think about how that change is reflective of this, history is cyclical. And so we started out before technology boomed, really having like this Monday to Friday experience, from what I understand from my parents' generation, where business was closed on Sundays and sometimes Saturdays. And there was this balance between your work life and your personal life. And so I think I've really the podcast has been drawing out this conclusion and this idea that you can have balance and still be successful, because so much of what I heard growing up and what I saw growing up is that the only way you can achieve success is by working your, off day in and day out, which is still true. I'm not throwing that away. But when people said you've got to work your tail off, it was in number of hours committed to something, not necessarily the value in what you're giving to something. So I really like how that kind of ties into what we're talking about today. How do you feel about that?
As you were saying that, there was a time in my life when I wanted to be a youth minister, and I was just thinking, amen, amen, amen. Like, this is all good stuff. So I think you're right. Like, we are renegotiating sort of what work looks like. And I like your astuteness in saying that history is cyclical, or at least it's often cyclical. So I have some questions about how much of work is going to change. And I think some of the buzzwordy stuff that's out there, I don't disagree that work is forever changed because of whatever happened over the past 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. However, I'm not sure that all the things that we've heard have really changed that much. So let me give you some examples. And I write this down before every interview. This is like basic job characteristics model, HR 101 stuff that we would teach our undergrads. These are the things that make motivating jobs: skill variety, task identity. Can we see something all the way through? Do we get meaningful feedback? Is our work significant? And do we have some sort of autonomous agency in how we approach our work? These 5 things. And so forget the labels on all those. I think all 5 of those are still incredibly important. Mm-hmm. But what's changed? I think it's probably the modes in which we tap into those things. So, obviously some of us have more flexibility now. We're able to work from different places. You and I are both communicating by Zoom. We're presumably working not from our office location right now. You mentioned the gender issue or the sex issue of, like, women in particular have had to renegotiate some boundaries. And some of that is positive. A lot of that has been unfair and really, really challenging, especially early in the pandemic years. And I have questions about, like, how does this shake out? And I'm not sure we're going to know for another, 2 to 4 years on this stuff. I think a big fear is we've given people a lot of flexibility, which has allowed us to make decisions, volitional, probably overall healthy decisions, to be more mindful with our family. I know this has been something that's affected me. But who's making the real big, meaningful, impactful decisions in some organizations? Is it the people that stayed at the office or have that luxury to go to the office? Mm-hmm. If so, like, we're going to have to reconcile, some of these tough trade-off decisions that we've had to make. And I'm really interested to see how it goes. I mean, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, no, I'm super interested in this too. I have been making a lot of assumptions on this podcast, theorizing a ton about how this will all shake out. 2 years ago, when I started this podcast, we were in the midst of lockdown in New York, and I was reading a lot about how women in the workforce were just dropping out of the workforce because, there's obviously a notion around the pay discrepancies and disparities. And so women not always being the breadwinners, they were like, okay, well, someone's got to stay home with the kids, and they were pulling out of the workforce. And I theorized, well, this is going to impact us generationally over decades, because the wage gap will continue to enlarge. And then beyond that, we'll experience fewer women, less diversity in the workforce. And this has actually, I'm not tooting my own horn here, but we've actually seen this kind of come to light. Not so much in the wage gap. That has obviously always been an issue and remains an issue, but it looks to be like it's closing more and more each year. However, we are seeing fewer women in the labor market, in the workforce, in the groups and pockets of people even looking for jobs. So this will, again, impact us generationally. And so I don't necessarily know from I can confirm this and I'd bet my life savings on it perspective, but I do like to make theories and predictions so that I can go back and say, oh yeah, I predicted it incorrectly, or I predicted correctly. And my prediction with this is that we are going to, and this is kind of going back to what I had said 2 years ago, that we are going to end up in this position of people are going to want more diversity, but there isn't going to be as diverse a pool of candidates, and it is only going to make things more difficult. I think there will be other individuals in the workforce who will want that same balance that women are saying, well, I have no option. I have to be there for my families. And of course, there are outliers here, right? So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the majority here. I think that we are going to see almost a regression. I do. And I'm actively fighting that. I think that we have to find a way to be in the workforce and strike a balance. And I think this is where ultimately, and this is where I'll put my money where my mouth is, businesses have to be the ones to make the change. They have to enable people to not sacrifice one thing for another. And this is kind of coming back to what I had said before, that I grew up seeing and hearing and experiencing this like workaholic, I am living to work, not working to live mentality. And I don't want that for myself. Organizations have to be able to separate the two. And that's, to me, the only way that we'll be able to change the course of what I would imagine is like the projected history in the future.
Yeah, that's good. And I admire and I sort of share your perspective of to advance really strong opinions, but have them loosely held so that we can talk about it.
I love that. That's exactly it. It's like, say exactly what I mean really strongly, but then also I'm happy to say I was wrong.
Yeah. So I'm definitely cheering for a different outcome than the one we're talking about. And organizations overall, not just any single organization, but our employers, I guess, really have an opportunity right now to do some positive things.
Yes.
And while I'm skeptical, I am also hopeful that at least some of the positive gains and some of the things that we've learned over the past few years will stick with us. I'll point out one sort of pretty scary thing that's causing some concern when I kind of think about what's going to happen. It's when everything went sideways and we were forced to do all of these things different. We got like a 6-month runway because it was a crisis and everybody was willing to just kind of, we'll do it because we know we still had empathy towards our leaders. Like we know they don't know what they're doing. We had empathy towards our subordinates, our employees. They didn't know what was happening. And then we kind of, I don't know if normalize is the right word, but we turned a corner and it became more routine than it was. While all this was going on, at least in the US and in many other developed economies, it was really hard to get talent. People were moving, people were quitting. It was impossible to hire people. Wages increased a lot. We know now part of that's probably tied with inflationary things, but whatever the case, like the employee, the worker really had some power in the employee-employer dynamic.
Right. Now
we see economies tightening. In the space that I'm doing a lot of work, which is sort of the tech space, the high growth space, we're seeing tightening of, we're not hiring as much. In some cases, we're actually doing RIFs. What happens when the employer takes back the power in that relationship? Do we immediately cede all that ground that we made together? Or do we immediately go back to the ways that it was in the old days? And now people that have made these decisions about how they're going to work and what they're going to prioritize get penalized even more. Mm-hmm. So lots of words just to say, I don't know, but I'm watching closely.
Yes, I'm with you. I think this is where the more we can talk about the implications and what could happen, and we make these predictions, not just us, but also other, thought leaders in this space and academics, especially writers, journalists, whoever is involved, politicians. I think it can sometimes prevent the worst case scenario because there's this anticipation and prevention. So I'm hoping that all of my babbling goes towards something positive in preventing any negative consequences for striking a balance and being in the driver's seat.
Well, certainly as a professor, I share your proclivity towards trying to talk away a problem.
Yeah.
We share this.
Right. I love it. Well, I know one of the things that really stuck with me when we first spoke was this concept, of course, of imposter syndrome. It is not a new concept, not a new ideology. But what we were talking about was this concept of either we back away or we deflect accountability. And imposter syndrome in many people tends to take over. And in others, it's this like, okay, I'm not backing away from what I want. I'm just going to go for it. This is like, I'm getting in my way. But when we think about imposter syndrome, I know we also started to talk about being self-aware and being a true imposter, that there are people in these buckets of maybe it's just imposter syndrome. There's a need to be a little bit more confident and self-aware and understanding of what your skill set is and appreciating that you could be ready for the next step and you just have to see yourself there. And then there's this trueness behind. Some people are just overjobbed and they have to be able to see what's right for them versus, where they need more growth. So when I think about this concept of the growth mindset coupled with imposter syndrome, I think that it all kind of comes down to self-awareness. So can you walk us through like how you see imposter syndrome and self-awareness and how, again, kind of tied with the growth mindset, how this all works together?
I will do my best. So I'm a big fan of self-awareness in general, and in my coaching and in my teaching and my consulting, sort of these one-off gigs, one of the first steps we always take is let's do some sort of assessment. One of the ones that I use is the Hogan assessments. You can do several different things with these. We're focusing on personality, derailers, things like this. You can do it at the team level also. But the tool is really not the most important thing. The most important thing is for people to see themselves, at least in passing, how others see them. So this is really, really important for understanding, where we're starting from and where we might need to go. So self-awareness is critical. Now, to this idea of imposter syndrome, I think the term has been overused quite a bit, and you hear it all the time. It is by far, probably the most important, self-development challenge that we encounter in People Leader Accelerators. People that feel like they're overjobbed, they feel like they cannot do this. Mm-hmm. And most of them are truly sufferers of imposter syndrome. And what I mean by that is these are people that have already shown they are successful, not only in their previous work, but they are succeeding right now in their current jobs, and they still don't feel like they're capable of doing it. I think the distinction with insecurity is that a lot of us will take a new job. We haven't yet proven that we can do this thing. And we call ourselves imposters. We might actually be imposters. We don't know yet. So imposter syndrome is about people that have already done something. There's some observable proof that you can do this job, and you still don't believe it. It's really odd. And it comes down to some common attribution errors. And so when we think about a normal person, whatever that means, I think me and you know that this person doesn't exist. But a lot of us, when we're not talking about jobs or something like this, when we have these are called fundamental attributions, and then we're going to get into this idea of fundamental attribution errors. When we have success, we say, oh, wow, that's because I worked hard. That's because I'm awesome. That's because I earned this success. And when something goes wrong for us, we don't make these internal attributions. We instead make external attributions, and we say, oh man, what a crappy environment, or my teammate screwed me, or something like this. It's not my fault. Like the teacher hated me. That's why I got a C. Now, when we suffer from imposter syndrome, we see a different pattern. When we get success, so somebody gets an A on a test, but they feel like they're a sufferer of imposter syndrome, what they do is they make some sort of external attribution. They say, I got lucky. I didn't deserve it. I sure just got lucky. And then when there's a failure, they make internal attributions. And they're like, I stink. I knew I couldn't do it. Blah, 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 blah. It's about me. And so what do we do to get past that? Well, self-awareness is one, but beyond that, I think the most important thing is to have a strong support group. And here you want mentors that are in different parts of your organization. You need friends, you need family. You want friends that have some sort of understanding of what you're going through. Interestingly, you want to be careful that your support group consists of more than just people that do the exact same job as you. So if you feel like an imposter, and you're a senior analyst at some big company, Deloitte, Goldman, whatever, and then you ask other senior analysts doing that exact same job for advice on how to do something, and then they give you an answer, well, now you've got a problem, because now you've validated your imposter syndrome, because the other people doing your job apparently, in your eyes, do understand it, whereas you didn't. So you want your support group to be kind of a diverse mix, including people that are not exactly in your role.
That's exactly it. When I think about who can support I like this idea of the support group. Who can support people in seeing the value that they add, in seeing their success? That's really important. At some level, and I'm pretty unapologetically this way, if someone has achieved success, let's say over 5 years, at some level, you've got to drop it. And I know that, we all have insecurities and we all have our, sometimes we stand in our own ways. And listen, there are moments where I feel imposter syndrome, but I tell myself, don't be ridiculous. Like, look at what has been accomplished. But this is where I mean, like, when I say to someone, and I know I'm very direct and I'm not trying to be insensitive, but it's like, sometimes you have to just get over it, and you have to stop telling yourself, you have to stop the self-doubt, and you have to look at what you've done. And this is where, for me, when I think about this term, like, think globally, it's not just about the added benefit when you're in a business and what you're doing to grow a business. It's also how you look at yourself. You have to think globally. You can't just look at yesterday or a week before. You have to look at the entire picture. So if someone, to me, like, you're entitled to imposter syndrome for a certain period of your career and at certain transitional moments in your career, and then you just have to get over it. But I realize that might be a little too direct for some people.
Well, I'm not far off on this. And I also, like, really struggle with self-doubt and insecurities. And I don't know that I have it figured out. Like, these things rear their ugly heads all the time. However, I think you're right. At some point, like, you have to learn, like, either this is what's going to define me or it's not. And so I know I have learned, like, I cannot be self-deprecating. I cannot, like, deflect all the time when I'm in front of certain audiences, or I lose credibility. I lose the audience. And you know what? Somebody else will get that job, not Brad Harris. Yeah. Likewise, when I'm coaching people, including a few people in People Leader Accelerator, it's like we can go on this for a few weeks, actually several weeks, like 7 or 8 weeks. It's a 16-week program. But if we're talking about the same issue of, like, not speaking up or being too afraid, past that, like, we have to have a pretty critical conversation. Like, you're going to go in that meeting and you're going to do X, or you're going to do this, and you're going to try it, and you may fail. But if you don't try it, like, we are probably not the program for you. I mean, we will always cheer for you as a person, but clearly our coaching, our advising is not effective. Yeah. So it's very much a decision. Are you willing to do this?
Yeah, there is so much pressure that we put on ourselves. And I'm the first one to say I do it to myself all the time. But we put so much pressure on ourselves, our career journeys, especially if we're high achieving, we want that next thing. And when you have all of that pressure, sometimes, the higher you climb, the less oxygen there is. Like, there's no one saving you the higher you go in your career. And so I think that level of pressure, if someone is experiencing continued self-doubt, you're actually going to impact the people who work for you. So I think that's where it's like, do you just need to feel more secure in what you're doing today to get to that next level? Is this not the right next thing for you? Because it's not good for anyone to feel insecure or, unready for the next step. Or is it that you just have to knock it off? So that's really where I kind of make that statement. It's coming from all of those perspectives.
Yeah. And I think we've kind of not been so specific in our discussion. It's like you're suggesting, it's one thing to suffer from these things when you're an individual contributor. Like, we can we can just say, like, you're not ready yet, and we can leave you alone, and we can it can be a long, drawn out process. But when we're leaders, like, we cast a shadow, we bring the weather, all of these things, and people are dependent on us. And that's probably one of the most compelling arguments I've heard that has caused people to kind of move to your position of, like, I got to knock it off. I got to do some different things. It's like, oh, wow, it's not just me that fails if I don't get this. It's my whole team that fails if I don't get this.
Right. And that is a lot of pressure. And I get that some people just don't want that, or they thought maybe they did, and they just are realizing that that's not what motivates them, succeeding in that type of high pressured experience. But this is, again, this all comes back to self-awareness. And I think it's okay if you think that you want it and you go for it, and then you realize this actually is not making me happy at all, and I have to go back to something that did make me happy.
Yeah. I mean, life is a process of elimination sometimes.
It's true. It's really true. I want to shift gears a little bit because we did have this conversation initially around organizational values and individual values. And this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. Sharing a personal anecdote here, which is very hard for me to do at this level because I kind of have always kept this side of my life very private for many reasons, mostly fear. But I am Jewish, and in my entire career, that's not something that I've always been very vocal about because of my own experience in hatred and things like that and discrimination. So I'm privileged in a way to be able to hide that side of me, although I don't want to, and I'm not doing it anymore. So naturally, we're recording this while organizations have addressed anti-Semitism in what Kanye West has shared, and I'm not even going to go into it because I'm not giving that any more energy. But I share this, or I bring this topic up because this is a perfect example of organizational values versus individual values. And I have had experiences where my personal values and even my personal safety have not been the priority, at least as a perception from me, by the organization. And I think this is something that everyone can relate to. If an organization holds values that align or misalign with my own values, how do I reconcile that? So I share that personal anecdote because I'm committed to being more of myself every day. And two, because I think it helps us to understand what we're talking about when it comes to our own individual values and organizational values. So where do we start with this? How do people not negotiate their own values? Or is there an opportunity to actually have a growth mindset if your organization doesn't hold the same values as you?
Yeah, that's a lot. So first of all, thank you for being open with me. I noticed that you also sort of revealed this in one of your recent episodes. Interestingly, I think it was the HR Nightmares episode that you also sort of said something about your own identity and how that influenced how you thought about a different situation. So I admire this idea that you're revealing more of yourself and you're kind of taking ownership of that.
Thanks.
This is a complicated topic for me. And so I want to be thoughtful of it. I hope you'll extend some grace as you sort of interpret that I'm still working through this myself. Sure. I think at the organizational level, it's unreasonable that one firm, especially if this firm is committed to some sort of diverse and inclusive workforce, is going to nail down the 3, 4, 5 values that represent everybody that works for them.
Right.
So I guess where I'll start with this is if I was leading an exec team or an organization towards some sort of values exercise, it starts with some canvassing of all the potential values that we could pick. Then we winnow down on what makes us actually different. Like you can think about a value like integrity. And I have yet to meet, although I've seen organizations not live up to integrity, I've never seen any organization that feels like we are anti-integrity here.
All right.
Put that on.
Right.
But these integrity, unless you have an exceptional reason why, I don't think integrity should be one of your top 3 core values. I think you're looking for the 3 things that you care about and that make you different, that can help you articulate something to your customers, but also to your employees. There's a really interesting study. It involves hospitals, and I saw this first from a Wall Street Journal opinion, and they're secondhand citing this. But Bob Sutton was one of the authors on this. He's a Stanford professor, and he's affiliated with this thing called the Friction Project. And in this hospital, or hospitals that had more than 4 values or something like this, had higher death rates or something like this than hospitals that had 3 or fewer. Which the idea is, if you have too much, you're focused on nothing. Okay. Now, so what do we do with if we only have 3, and we'll say 3 to 5 to be safe, if we're advocating that an organization only have 3 to 5 really meaningful values, what do we do about all of these other things that our employees and even our customers care about that are super important to them? And here, I have to lay a stake in the ground firmly that I don't know. But beyond that, like the temptation with this Adidas stuff and with Ye and the anti-Semitism that's coming out is some organizations are going to make statements, probably justifiably so. They're going to come out and say, we are against this. Some organizations will take it a step further and sort of update their values to reflect this, probably in some sort of broad way. The risk when you're constantly updating your values based on the latest celebrity issue is now you've painted yourself into a corner where someone can say, well, if you're not explicitly against this thing, or if you're not explicitly for this value, you must be against it. And I think that's a tricky spot for.
I totally agree.
So totally. I think the challenge is to pick 3 values that really matter, but in that, whether it's separately or it's in part of those 3 values, you really have to make sure you are living what you say you're living. Things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that means, if you want me to, there's several phrases on values that I think are kind of helpful, and they come across as sort of cliche, but if you want to know your values, look at your calendar and look at your pocketbook. Similarly, if you want to know your values, show me who you hire and you fire, and that'll give me some idea of what your values are. And so this is sort of how I think about it at the org level. Now, at the individual level, you're trying to get a good enough fit where you can be yourself. Maybe you don't even have to be your whole self, but you can be enough of yourself that for those 8 to 10 hours a day or whatever it is you work, you're not in direct violation of any of your core values.
I love what you have shared in that whole last few minutes, because it's made me think of a few things. One, I totally agree. Organizations cannot, it is dangerous actually to constantly change values because it looks inauthentic, it looks performative, and it just creates a lot of confusion. And I agree. I think there are certain things that we have to expect from business and from business leaders, and integrity is one of those things. And, honesty is another thing, right? So there are things that I think that having a value that's explicit in that way just makes it look like you're taking the easy way out. Like, let's really think about the values that we want our organization to uphold and drive. And it should be different than those things, because those things should be a given and built into just the culture of any organization, in my opinion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, there was an episode that I did maybe a year ago where I said cancel culture. And that was the title because I mean it. And I even mean it in this situation. I don't think it's helpful when we don't have conversations. However, there are moments when people say they're not willing to learn and change and have conversations. And in this case with Ye, we see that that's true. And I think that when we see Adidas and Balenciaga and Gap and The Real all saying enough is enough, I think that this is where we can say at an organizational level, they're saying that from a values perspective, they're not tolerating hate. And when you say that, I think, we saw a lot through social justice movements in 2020 that companies were figuring this out. How do we address hate? How do we take the importance of individual values? This is where the driver's seat, again, the employee was hugely in the driver's seat, and I think remains there, that individuals needed to feel safe. People needed to go to work knowing that their company didn't take joy in seeing violence against their communities. And I think that is like single-handedly the most important takeaway when it comes to any changes that a company might make or any statement that they might make regarding something that might compromise an individual's values, that therein could compromise an organization's values. And when you say, when any action a company takes sends like 17 messages or like 100 messages, it's like each person is going to have their own takeaway. So I agree that you have to feel maybe 70% like yourself, or 60%, maybe a little bit of the majority, at least 60% like yourself at work. Your values have to align 60% of the time. These are totally arbitrary numbers that I'm throwing out there and have absolutely no statistical value. But at the end of the day, when I think about my own experience, it's like, if I don't feel like I can be myself, but I feel safe and can eventually be my authentic self, that's more important than anything else. And I think psychological safety, I know that I'm sure that you're thinking through this too, but this has been a huge, huge topic since 2020. And that for me is like the core of it all. You don't have to, actually, I don't think organizations should ever feel that they have to respond to every single thing. In fact, I have struggled with this at a podcast level. Like, I care about all of these things, but I'm not an expert in I'm an expert in my own experience. And so how can I be authentic and not just say something just because I have the opportunity, but really say something that matters, bring on people who are experts in these topics so that it's not just, again, like this performance of feeling like I need to do it. And this is where organizations, I think, if they can create a safe environment for everyone from all backgrounds so that they can have conversations and they can encourage people to have open dialogue that might result in people disagreeing with one another. That's much more productive than an environment that says we are only going to be this way, no discussion about it, and then people don't feel safe in bringing up their own experiences, even if they align with the organization's values. Because to me, it all comes down to this psychological safety. Businesses have a huge influence on how society acts and interacts intersectionally. So the more businesses can just say, we're not experts in this, but we want to create a safe space and we want to have the conversation with everyone, the better.
I'm glad to be in the audience for that. I appreciate you sharing that. I think the first thing that came to mind is, why didn't I think to bring up psychological safety? So Amy Edmondson's work is the one that coined this term, is like super influential in sort of my spheres of research, especially around teams, but also organizations. You're right. Like it's a fundamental parts of our job that we need to feel safe so that we can really thrive. And so yes. And this idea that you're wrestling with things and trying to just listen to different conversations and not like project all of your lived experience out on everyone else, I admire that. I have a feeling this is going to be a constant tension for all of us that are really genuinely interested in trying to advance a better world for all of us, including at work. So that's a short reply, but preach.
Yeah. No, I love it. And psychological safety, individual values, organizational values. At the end of the day, it comes back to what I said in the beginning, humanity. This is the human experience, the human condition. We all want to feel accepted and safe and welcomed and thought of and considered. And we also all want to be intrinsically and authentically who we are. And I really think that the only moments that I can at least reflect on where I didn't necessarily feel like I could be myself was really in places or environments where people had never met someone like me, in this case, someone Jewish, or had a misunderstanding or misrepresentation. And again, this lack of understanding, it comes from a lack of knowledge. And what enables more knowledge is conversations, education, opportunities to learn. And you can't do that if you don't talk and you don't have exposure to people from different backgrounds. I always say on this podcast too that it's really important, not just in diversity in representation, but also in diversity of thought. Having people around you that think differently from you, that don't agree with you. And I'm sure that there are people who listen to the podcast who disagree all the time. And I'm glad. I hope that they do, because there is nothing worse than having a group of people in a room who all agree. You're not growing, you're not learning, there's no challenge. Rounding out this conversation on the growth mindset, what would be your advice to someone who maybe is struggling with vocalizing their ideas? Maybe it has nothing to do with their values, but just vocalizing their ideas, feeling like they can really be loud and proud about who they are and what they believe at work, what they want to see at work, and seeing this not just from like a confidence perspective, but actually from a growth mindset perspective, that this will enable their further growth. What would you say? What's your advice to those folks?
Yeah, I mean, I end every one of my classes with this kind of my mantra on how I want my students to approach their world going forward. And it's be you, be kind, And the last one, or the third one, is be bold. The last one is be great. But the be bold one is really interesting. And I try to push this idea that the answer is always it depends. That frustrates people. Especially the undergraduates. They just cannot stand this mantra. But what I'm trying to convey in that, or at least part of that, is there are far fewer rules out there in the world than we think there are. We often think there's a system, there's a formula for getting it exactly right. But once you kind of get over the overwhelm of understanding no one has all the answers, it gets a little bit easier. Not easy, but a little bit easier to see that there is a place for me, Brad Harris, Tracy, whoever, to really add value in a unique way. And I also, clearly being different can be an asset. One of the best books I read in the past, 3 or 4 years is a book called Edge by Laura Wong. She's a friend of mine. And she gives all of these stories about people that came from a lot of adversity and how they turned that adversity into some sort of advantage that drove them to success. Now, it's not an easy book to read. It's not a fairy tale, but there is just a lot of compelling arguments in Laura's book that, there is something inside of us that the world needs. And part of it's on us to find our place. And it's a journey for sure. But if we're not bold enough to take a chance, it never gets out there.
Right. I love that. I really appreciate that. I think all of this conversation has been really inspiring and really helpful. I know from as far as my listeners go, there are tons and tons of listeners who are breaking into HR and really are trying to get their footing and are trying to grow into that next, C-suite track, right? And all of this, I love that you say it always depends, because it does. It depends. Everything can end with it depends or be answered with it depends. And I love that you said that be you, be kind, be bold, because it's really underpinning all of the things that we've spoken about today.
Well, for any of your listeners, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Brad Harris. I mean, I'm happy to help where I can. I will also be the first to say, I don't know if I don't. But we also have some resources on People Leader Accelerator, our website, peopleleaderaccelerator.com. And if anybody wants to download any of our paid guides, you get one for free if you enter the code podcast. So we are just one of several communities out there to help these people that are just breaking through. But yeah, find your group and find your home. And I think, Tracy, you and I we're cheering for these people, right?
Yes, we're cheering for you. You've got this. That's awesome. Well, Dr. Brad Harris, I'm definitely going to make sure that I link that and everything in the show notes so that everyone can get their guides and be on their way to the journey of success. And so I really appreciate your time. I appreciate that you spent all of this time with us. So thank you so much. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.